One fall night in 1977, a pastor and his young daughter disappeared from their town as if they had never existed. For nearly 3 decades, it was called a runaway. The police wrote it off as an accident, a lost cause. The church, they kept quiet, but the wife didn't. Then, one October morning, the phone rang. A police officer's voice came through and a 27-year-old secret was revealed, along with heartbreaking details. 2004, Eldridge. Sarah Freeman lived a quiet life on the northern edge of Eldridge, Arkansas, a small town hidden behind ancient maple trees, as silent as the grief she'd carried for nearly 3 decades. At 63, Sarah was no longer the vibrant woman she once was. She lived in an old clapboard house, its shingles worn, its walls patched with faded coats of paint. No husband, no children, no faith in God. All the fallout of an autumn night in 1977, the night her husband, Reverend Elijah Freeman, and their little girl, Grace, vanished without a trace. People said he'd gone missing. The church declared he'd left due to a spiritual crisis. Some whispered that he'd run away with their daughter, but Sarah never believed it. Elijah was no coward, and he would never have taken Grace without a word. For 27 years, she searched for the truth, until the town forgot, until the case files gathered dust. She gave up. She stopped praying, stopped going to church. She survived, but she wasn't really living, until that morning. Sarah was making coffee in her small kitchen, sunlight streaming through the curtains, lighting up an old photo on the shelf. Elijah on the pulpit, his arm around a smiling Grace. The landline phone rang. It was an old rotary phone she hadn't used in ages. Sarah hesitated, then picked it up. A deep, slow voice came from the other end. "Mrs. Sarah Freeman? This is Sergeant Ronald Gale, Crawford County Sheriff's Department." Sarah frowned. "Speaking," she said, her voice cautious. "We just got a report from a forestry crew in the southwest Ouachita National Forest. A logger found an old duffel bag, buried under the roots of a dead tree. Inside was a set of clerical robes, a Bible, and a rag doll." Sarah froze. The air seemed to thin. Her hand trembled. "Could you describe the items in more detail, Sergeant?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am. The Bible has the name, Elijah Freeman. Would you be able to come and identify them?" Sarah didn't answer right away. She stood still in the kitchen, hand gripping the receiver. She no longer heard the police officer's voice, but echoes of the past. Elijah's sermons in the sanctuary, Grace's laughter as she ran around the backyard. A rag doll, Sarah remembered. Grace had a rag doll with long arms, a red dress, and yarn hair. She called it Clara. She never let go of it, not even when she slept. When the two disappeared, the doll vanished too. She never found it. It wasn't a coincidence. She knew it. It couldn't be. Sarah drove to the local police station that morning. Sergeant Gale was waiting, showing her photos taken at the scene. The gray Adidas bag was faded, the fabric frayed at the corners. The Bible was damp, but the name Elijah was still legible. The black clerical robes were old, but the embroidered cross on the collar was clear. And finally, Clara. The rag doll, red dress, yarn hair, stained with age. One eye was missing, but Sarah recognized it instantly. She reached out and touched the photo lightly. Her fingertips trembled. "That was my daughter's," she whispered. Sergeant Gale nodded slightly, making a note in his notepad. "We're securing the area, but since the bag was buried pretty deep, we suspect it's been there for decades." "How could someone bury it there?" Sarah asked, not expecting an answer. She was talking to herself. That afternoon, Sarah went home. She sat in the living room, the dim light of the afternoon casting shadows on old mementos. On the table were printed documents from the police station, neatly clipped together. But she didn't open them. Instead, she opened an old drawer and took out an old local map, its paper yellowed. The Ouachita National Forest was southwest of town, more than 10 miles from Mount Olive Church. There was no reason for anyone to accidentally bury a bag of clerical items there. Sarah marked the area on the map, She added a note. Clara, where it begins. She understood this wasn't just a random discovery. This was the first sign in 27 years. And if she didn't do something, no one would do it for her. That night, Sarah didn't sleep. She sat by the window, looking out at the backyard where Grace used to play. Every memory returned like a tiny needle pricking her mind. Elijah used to say, "If you can't find light in the church, carry your own lamp." Sarah had let her lamp go out for too long. It was time to relight it. The next morning, Sarah packed a small bag. She took the map, Elijah's old notebooks, and Grace's little locket. Before leaving the house, she stopped in front of the family photo, placing her hand on Elijah's face. "We'll find out," she whispered. The wooden door closed behind her. The engine started up in the dim morning light. Sarah's old pickup truck stopped at the edge of a red dirt trail leading into the Ouachita National Forest. Police tape cordoned off an area of a few dozen square feet. Under the dense canopy, sunlight struggled to penetrate, making the forest dark and heavy with an odd feeling, as if the place itself held a secret it didn't want disturbed. Sarah got out of the car, holding her bag, her eyes tense and her steps hesitant. She wasn't the woman who used to walk in the woods as a young girl. Now, every dry branch cracking under her feet made her stop. But something stronger than age was driving her, the urge to find the truth. Sergeant Ronald Gale approached, pulling his hat low on his forehead. He nodded. "Thanks for coming. We've kept the scene as we found it. Nothing's been moved." Sarah nodded slightly, her eyes fixed on the disturbed earth. The oak tree where the bag was found had been dead for a long time, its trunk hollow, its bark peeling, as if it had witnessed too many things that needed to be buried deep. "How deep was it buried?" she asked. "About 30 inches. The logger almost missed it. Luckily, the tree roots came loose after a heavy rain." Sarah approached the hole, where the bag had been lifted out and placed on a tarp. The bag was decayed, the zipper rusted, but it was still intact enough to be identified. The cleric's robes, the Bible, and the red rag doll, Clara, were on the tarp. She crouched down, touching the Bible lightly. Her hand trembled as she turned the pages. Under the slightly moldy paper on the first page, handwritten letters appeared. Elijah's handwriting, she recognized it immediately. "God sees all. I cannot be silent any longer." Sarah closed her eyes for a moment. A long breath escaped, as if those words had pierced through time, striking her heart. "When did he write this?" she asked softly. "We don't know, but the ink is faded. We can only say it's from a few decades ago," Sergeant Gale replied, trying to keep his voice calm. She stood up. Her eyes looked around the forest, a wilderness, no trails, far from the main road. Sarah thought for a moment, then asked, "Why would someone bury things here? This isn't a place where people casually dump things." Gale shrugged. "We think so too, but to be honest, this disappearance is too old. No one on my team ever worked the case. The files are deep in storage, some are even missing. We can reopen it if we have new evidence, but right now..." He left the sentence unfinished. Sarah turned to look at him, her eyes sharp. "What do you call this, if not evidence? A missing pastor's clothes, a Bible with his name, a doll his daughter carried, and the last thing he wrote? Isn't that enough to reopen it?" Gale was silent for a few seconds, then said, "I'll report to my superiors. But please understand, Sarah, not everyone wants to stir up this past." She turned silently back to the car. The bag couldn't be taken. It was evidence, but Sarah asked to photograph everything, especially the handwriting. She saved them in her old camera, then carefully wrote down every detail in her notebook. On the way back, she drove slowly, her eyes fixed on the trees passing by. Questions began to form. Why such a remote forest? Why were the belongings buried so deep? And why buried, instead of burned or disposed of elsewhere? Someone wanted to hide, but still leave a message. That evening, Sarah spread the photos on the dining table. The yellow light shone on Elijah's writing. She rewrote it many times, each time with a different stroke, as if to memorize every fold in her heart. God sees all. I cannot be silent any longer. That sentence wasn't just a goodbye. It was a sign, a message left for the only person he believed would still search, her. Sarah tapped her pen on the notebook. If he wanted to speak, what made him silent? She turned to the filing cabinet, taking out the old papers, copies of the 1977 investigation. The names of the investigators, the statements of the witnesses, the list of assets left by Reverend Elijah, missing a personal diary. Sarah remembered. Elijah always carried a small black notebook, but it wasn't on the list of confiscated items, an anomaly. She underlined the note in the file. No personal belongings found outside the office. She added next to it, or were they taken beforehand? Outside, the night wind blew through the trees. The rustling wind was like a reminder that the past wasn't dead, just waiting for the right person to stir it up. Sarah sat up straight, her eyes brighter than in the morning. The fear in her had given way to something clearer, a goal. If they don't reopen the case, I'll do it for them, she mumbled. Sarah marked a red dot on the map, the tree where the bag was found. Underneath she wrote, the real starting point. She locked the door, turned off the lights, and went to her room. For the first time in 27 years, she didn't dream of that fateful night. Instead, she dreamed of Elijah, standing in the forest, reaching out, as if pointing the way. Sarah drove away from the house after a night of outlining every detail. On the passenger seat was the notebook she was writing in, a diagram of the bag's location, photos of the scene, Elijah's notes, and questions she underlined in red ink. Why buried? Who last saw Elijah? Who had the office key when he disappeared? She decided to start where her husband worked for many years before he disappeared with Grace, Mount Olive Baptist Church. The dirt road leading to the church hadn't changed. Along the old wooden fence covered in moss, Sarah stopped the car for a moment. From a distance, the church looked like a gray-white box standing alone in a large field, its roof tiles faded, its windows dusty, its steeple silent. This place used to be the center of the Eldridge community. When Elijah was alive, every Sunday, the ringing bells gathered everyone, men in suits, women in long dresses, children laughing. But now, only a few old people came to church. Most had moved away, or simply no longer cared. Sarah stepped onto the porch and pushed open the old wooden door. The creaking hinges were like the lament of forgotten memories. Inside, the church was clean, but lifeless. A man was arranging prayer books near the pulpit. He turned around when he heard footsteps. "Sarah Freeman?" he asked, his voice soft and warm, almost delighted. Sarah nodded. "Hello, Harold." Pastor Harold, gray hair, tall, wearing a light gray suit, still had the same dignified look as before. "I heard about the bag in the forest," he said in a low voice. "I am truly sorry if that stirred up old wounds and caused you pain again." "I never stopped hurting, Harold," Sarah replied succinctly. The air stopped for a beat. Reverend George walked in from the side, rubbing his hands together, his smile wide to his ears. Unlike Harold, George looked energetic, with a friendly smile on his face. His eyes moved constantly, never stopping long enough for others to feel the truth. "Oh my, Sarah Freeman. Long time no see. You look so healthy. It's a pity to meet again in such circumstances." He dragged out his voice, smiling and shaking his head as if he was sad for her. Sarah just smiled politely. She didn't come here to socialize. "I want to go back to Elijah's old office. There are a few things I need to check, if you don't mind." A moment of silence. Harold glanced at George. George shrugged, still smiling, but unable to hide the frown that flashed across his face as if his plan had been interrupted. Of course," Harold said. "Although, no one has used that room for a long time. We locked it up to protect it. But you're Elijah's wife. You have the right." He took the key from the cabinet and gave it to her and followed her into Elijah's office. The old office was at the end of the hallway behind the pulpit. Sarah opened the door. The small dark room smelled of old paper and musty wood. The leather-upholstered wooden chair Elijah used to sit on was still on the table. She walked in, not touching anything yet. Her eyes scanned every detail. Harold stood behind, arms crossed. George stood outside the door, whistling softly, pretending to look at the paintings hanging on the wall. Sarah opened the first desk drawer, empty. The second drawer, a few prayer books, hymns. The third drawer, stuck. She had to pull hard. Inside was a pile of scrap paper, the black cover old. Sarah carefully pulled it out, sat down at the table and flipped through it. Inside were church expense statements, 1976, 1977. There were notes for spending money on equipment maintenance, sound upgrades, special security services. No original invoices, no signatures. The amount, 3 to 5 times higher than usual. Sarah frowned. She wrote it down with her pen. "This document is not in the archives," she said without looking up. "Maybe people missed it," Harold replied calmly. George interrupted. "You know, Sarah, this room used to be used as a temporary warehouse for several years. Maybe something was put in by mistake. Or forgotten." Sarah folded the paper, stood up, facing the two men. "I don't think Elijah forgot. I think he kept it for a reason." Harold and George didn't answer. A heavy silence dragged on. On the way out of the church, Sarah stopped in front of a large painting hanging in the main hall, a group photo taken on Christmas, 1976. Elijah stood in the middle, his hand lightly on Grace's shoulder. Harold stood on the left, George on the right. Sarah's eyes lingered the longest on the two men. She remembered Harold's eyes in the room. Although he spoke calmly, he didn't look her in the eye. George always tried to look busy, talking vaguely, but his eyes glanced down at the document she was holding. Returning home, Sarah spread the expense paper on the table. She underlined the large, unexplained expenses. On the first page, she added a line. Elijah knew, and they knew he knew. She didn't have clear evidence, but these first clues made her certain of one thing. The church was hiding part of the truth, and Sarah would be the last one to force them to tell it. It was late afternoon when Sarah returned to the wooden house by the forest. The sunset light poured through the dusty window panes, casting streaks of orange on the old wooden floor. The air was strangely quiet, as if the whole world was holding its breath, waiting for something to be revealed. She put her bag on the chair, took off her coat, and walked into the memory room, where she kept her and Elijah's past in numbered cardboard boxes. She had never opened them since he disappeared. Today, she had to. Sarah pulled the biggest box out into the middle of the room. Dust clung to the edges of the box, but the black ink label was still clear. Elijah, 1976 to 1977. She opened the lid, revealing layers of papers, books, and folders. There were printed sermons, letters to the congregation, a few Bibles with marked passages, and a small notebook, black leather cover, spiral bound, the string already rotten. She recognized it as soon as she saw it. Elijah's diary. Sarah gently opened the notebook. The first page was dated March 1977. His handwriting, neat, slightly slanted to the right, was still very clear, as if it had only been written yesterday. She sat down, opened the book to the middle, where the bookmark was broken. A note made her stop for a long time. If they refuse to repent, I will speak before the congregation. I cannot be silent in the face of wrongdoing. God loves truth, not holy masks. Sarah felt her heart ache. This was no longer the words of a pastor recording daily feelings. This was a warning, a plan, an oath. She continued reading. The following pages recorded fragmented observations. Sound upgrade fund, spent $5,200, no equipment imported. Harold signed 3 expense vouchers, but did not state the reason. Financial documents taken from the office. George evaded. Sarah stopped, taking out the financial notes from the day before. She compared the numbers. They matched. $5,200. Harold. No equipment imported. Elijah knew. He had investigated, and he was preparing to make it public. Sarah stood up, starting to walk around the room. Not out of confusion, but because she needed to act to calm herself. What she was holding in her hands was not just a memory, but an unspoken statement, evidence of a conspiracy that had been hidden for 27 years. She sat down at her desk, spreading out the diary, expense notes, and copies of old reports. Each thing was a piece of the puzzle. She wrote in her notebook, Elijah suspected embezzlement within the church. He tracked finances, planned to reveal the truth, and then he disappeared. So did Grace. I saw Harold's eyes, George's expression, the way they blocked the door. They're afraid of the past coming back. She underlined a line in Elijah's diary. Cannot be silent in the face of wrongdoing. And then she wrote, Now it's my turn to speak. It was getting dark. Sarah took out her phone. She searched her old contacts, stopping at a name she had forgotten for many years, Carl Jennings, the only former investigator who saw Elijah's disappearance as something shady. He was withdrawn from the case after only 3 weeks of investigation for personnel restructuring. Sarah remembered very well the day he came to her house in 1977. He brought a notebook, asked many questions, and recorded every detail. But then he disappeared from the case, as if someone had deliberately pushed him out. Sarah pressed the call button. After a few rings, an elderly man's voice rang out, slightly hoarse but still strong. Jennings speaking. Carl, it's me, Sarah Freeman. Silence. Then he said softly, cautiously, I guess you want to talk about the bag that was recently found in the forest. I need to see you. Tomorrow. All right. Sarah put down the phone. She folded the diary, her hand still on the leather cover, as if holding a piece of Elijah's soul. The dim lamplight shone on the papers, scattered evidence that was beginning to string together into a path, and this time, they wouldn't be able to silence her. Sarah drove the next morning, following the dirt road out of Eldridge. The thin morning sunlight shone through the old pine trees, but it wasn't enough to soothe the simmering tension in her heart. She carried in her bag Elijah's diary, financial notes, and a few photos of the buried bag. Each item was now like a brick on the road she was walking, and the person she was about to meet might be the last one to put those bricks together. Carl Jennings's house was secluded between 2 small hills, behind a dense oak forest. The one-story wooden house, not large but tidy, was surrounded by a wooden fence and a carefully maintained small garden. There was something in the way this place existed, alone, quietly, not blending into the town, that made Sarah think Carl was still himself after all these years. She stopped the car and went to knock on the door. After a moment of silence, a man in his 60s, tall with gray hair, a simple shirt and faded jeans came out. He looked at Sarah for a long time, as if confirming that she had really returned. I thought you'd be here sooner, Carl said, his voice hoarse. Sarah replied, I brought what you need to see. Carl invited her into the living room. Everything here was arranged as if he was still an investigator. Local maps on the walls, drawers containing files, bookshelves full of documents. A corner of the room was a large table full of papers, not by accident, but in intentional order. I never believed Elijah left, Carl said after pouring her a cup of coffee. And I never forgot the look in your eyes that day. A person who doesn't believe their husband left is a trustworthy person. They said I was too emotional, not sober, Sarah smiled faintly. But they forgot that a wife's feelings are often right. Sarah opened her bag and gave Carl a copy of Elijah's diary. Carl silently read each page, his eyes gradually hardening. When he reached the line, If they refuse to repent, I will speak before the congregation. I cannot be silent in the face of wrongdoing. He looked up, said softly, his eyes slowly scanning several times and then looking up at Sarah. He knew, and he may have been very close to the truth. Sarah nodded. I found financial notes that match the numbers in the diary. Harold and George's names are in it. I'm scared, Carl. But I also see one thing clearly. They don't want the truth to be mentioned again. Carl stood up, walked to the metal filing cabinet, unlocked it, and pulled out a thick file marked Freeman, Unresolved. This is a copy of the original file that I kept before I was withdrawn from the case. Some of this is no longer in the police archives. Sarah took each page and read it carefully. Initial statements from some parishioners, a map of the church, Elijah's schedule in his final days. But what caught her attention most was a black and white photo that had never been published. The photo showed Elijah standing with Harold and George on October 10th, 1977, just 3 days before he disappeared. Elijah wasn't smiling. His face was tense, his eyes looking outside the frame. Harold was holding Elijah's shoulder as a friendly gesture, but in his eyes, there was something controlling. George, as usual, smiled widely, but didn't look at the camera. This photo never appeared in the official file, Carl said. I took it from a parishioner's personal collection. A week after Elijah disappeared, that family left town without notice. You think they were threatened? Sarah asked. I think they knew something and were forced to be silent. Carl put the photo down, then took out a map of the Mount Olive Church Cemetery. The paper was yellowed, but still had a red circle in one corner, plot number 17. I used to pay attention to this grave. It's marked as a dog's grave belonging to a parishioner named Trenton, but there's no valid burial record, no caregiver, no one visits. Even stranger, the burial date is only 2 days after Elijah disappeared. Sarah looked at the red dot, feeling a chill down her spine. Partly because this suspicion was too close to the truth, partly because she had never thought that. They might have buried Elijah there. I always suspected this wasn't a dog's grave, Carl said softly. And now, with the bag buried nearly 10 miles away, I believe we're right. Sarah stood up, grabbing the map. She looked at Carl, then said in a strangely calm voice, If they buried the memory, then I'll dig it up. Carl nodded, his eyes flashing something different. No longer weariness, but a revived will. They discussed a little and then decided to go to the church cemetery the next day. Sarah left to prepare. 3 days later, the sky over Eldridge was shrouded in darkness, the thin moonlight quietly seeping through the gray clouds. On the edge of the Mount Olive Church Cemetery, 2 figures were crouching low under the fence, Sarah and Carl. They didn't say anything during the drive here. Each kept their own thoughts. But one thing they both understood. If they went during the day, they would never be allowed to examine this land closely. No one in the church wanted anyone to turn over what had been buried. Carl spread the cemetery map on the car hood. He also held a satellite photo printed from Google Earth. Under the dim flashlight, they compared the location of plot number 17, where Carl had circled in red, with the current state of the land. Southwest corner, near the brick wall, there are 2 dog graves listed, but only one has a headstone. Carl pointed, whispering. Sarah looked towards that direction. The grass was ankle-high, no one taking care of it. 2 small headstones were hidden behind the bushes. One said, Buddy, 1975 to 1977. The other was just a blank stone. Sarah felt her skin get cold, not from the night wind. They approached, Carl using a small shovel to probe the ground. The soil was unexpectedly loose, easy to dig, as if it had been dug and refilled. Sarah took a step back, her eyes stopping at the blank stone. No name engraved, no date, just a stone placed on top, as if to mark it without leaving a trace. Carl nodded. I've seen this in old cases. The person hiding the body didn't have enough time to build a complete fake grave, just needed to mark it for themselves. You think Grace or Elijah is under there? Sarah asked, her voice shaking slightly. Carl was silent. He didn't want to guess, not with Sarah. Just then, a branch snapped at the end of the cemetery. They both turned around quickly. Under the dim flashlight, they saw a man standing hidden behind the weeping willows. Carl approached, his voice deep. "Who's there?" The man didn't answer, but didn't run. As Carl got closer, he stepped out of the shadows. An old man with a white beard, an old baseball cap, holding an extinguished cigarette, deep and wary eyes. "I know what you're doing," he said, "and I also know I shouldn't get involved, but I heard that name." "Elijah Freeman." Carl stopped, nodding slightly. "Who are you?" "My name is Luther. I used to work as a carpenter for Mount Olive Church for nearly 20 years. After that, I quit." Sarah looked at him intently. This name had passed through a few times in Elijah's file, but had never been investigated deeply. A name outside the circle of suspicion. Until now. "Why do you care about Elijah?" Sarah asked. Luther hesitated. His eyes glanced around the cemetery, as if afraid someone was watching. Then he said softly, "This place isn't for telling the truth. Meet me tomorrow morning. The woodshop behind Road 12. I'll tell you what I saw 27 years ago." The next morning, at Luther's old woodshop. The shop wasn't big. The smell of wood, sawdust, and machine oil mixed together. Luther was waiting, holding a cup of weak coffee, not saying anything until the door was locked behind them. "I'm not a busybody," he began, "but I'm someone who can keep their mouth shut. Still do. It's just, Mr. Elijah was a kind man, and I shouldn't have been silent." Sarah and Carl sat still, waiting for him to continue. "One night in late October that year, George called me to repair part of the warehouse behind the church. He said there was theft, and they needed to seal the basement to protect the property. Strange, but I accepted. Cash, paid in advance. I arrived near midnight. The hallway lights were still on, the warehouse door open. George was there, no one else. He pulled a large cart, covered with a tarp. What was underneath was very heavy. I helped push it over the steps down to the basement." Sarah held her breath. "Did you see what was underneath?" Luther shook his head. I asked. He said it was an old broken pulpit, ready to be thrown away, but a wooden pulpit wouldn't be that heavy, and there was no reason to move it at midnight. Carl leaned forward, asking, "That basement? Is it still there?" "I'm not sure. Years later, I heard the church used it as a food storage and then locked it up, but I believe what he hid that night wasn't wood." Sarah looked at Carl. A flash of lightning shone in her eyes. Every small detail, the bag in the forest, diary notes, church finances, the photo of the three men, the nameless grave, now had a clear intersection. The church basement. If Elijah or Grace were ever hidden, then the basement may have been the first place, she said softly. Carl nodded. "We need to check that place, and this time, it's not just us." Outside, it started to rain lightly. Sarah squeezed the leather bag containing Elijah's diary. Carl lit a cigarette, turning his face to the shop window. Luther poured more coffee, saying quietly, "Don't let them clean it up before you get there." Then, taking another long drag, he continued, "You can go to the nursing home and find Mrs. Ann, although she is old and has a poor memory. But maybe she will be able to say something." Sarah and Carl then said goodbye to the old man and quickly returned home to prepare to go to the nursing home. On the afternoon of the third day, Sarah stopped in front of the Southfield nursing home. The two-story red brick building looked gentle and quiet, with rows of yellowing maple trees in front of the gate. She took a deep breath, holding tight to an old photo reprinted from Carl's file, a family photo of Elijah at Christmas 1976, with Grace in a red dress standing next to her parents. Ruth Ann used to be the pastor's right hand, taking notes, managing records, contacting parishioners. After Elijah disappeared, she quit suddenly. No one asked about it. Sarah still remembered that petite figure, quick, principled, and dedicated to every number. Ruth Ann's room was on the second floor, at the end of the hall. The nurse said that the old woman had early-stage dementia. Sometimes she was lucid, sometimes she spoke nonsense. Sarah didn't expect much, but she needed to try. The door opened. The room was simple, with a few old pictures hanging on the wall. Ruth Ann was sitting by the window, knitting, her eyes absent-mindedly looking out at the misty garden. Sarah walked over slowly, not in a hurry. "Ruth, I'm Sarah. Sarah Freeman, Elijah's wife." The old woman didn't react. Sarah sat down by the bed, taking out the photo. "Do you remember them? Elijah and little Grace." The knitting hands stopped. Ruth Ann looked at the photo. Her initially dull eyes suddenly changed. A choked breath came from her throat. She reached out with trembling hands, lightly touching Elijah's image, then Grace's, and she started to cry. "No one listened to him," Ruth Ann whispered, her eyes not leaving the photo. "They silenced him, like people lock filing cabinets and throw the keys down the well." Sarah sat still. She took out her phone, secretly recording. "Can you explain more, Ruth? Who locked it? What file?" Ruth shook her head, retreating as if someone had pulled her out of the memory zone. "No, I shouldn't. They told me just rewrite it, then put it away. I'm just a typist." Sarah softened her voice. "I know you didn't do anything wrong. I just need to know. What was Elijah planning to do that day? Why did he disappear?" Ruth bowed her head, her voice as small as the wind. "He found fake financial records. He wanted to read it before the entire congregation. Harold changed the lock on the file room. I didn't have a new key. That night, there was Grace screaming in the church hall. I heard it, but I didn't go out. I didn't dare." Sarah felt her chest tighten. "Are you sure it was Grace's voice?" "It was her." Ruth nodded. "I heard footsteps running, then someone being dragged. There was the sound of things breaking, then silence." She looked up, her eyes like a child begging for forgiveness. "I didn't do anything." Sarah took her hand. "It's okay. You're helping now." At the same time, at Carl Jennings's house, he was reviewing copies of financial records from 1977. One detail made him stop. There were two versions of the year-end statement, both printed from the church office, both signed by Harold. But the ink, the thickness of the lines, and the slope of the letters were completely different. Carl took out a magnifying glass and examined the signature, Reverend Harold Simmons. One version leaned to the left, decisive. The other leaned to the right, shaky and weak. Clearly, there was a forged signature. Not only that, the version with the forged signature noted spending $3,000 on parish hall renovation services. Carl compared it to the original. There was no such item. The signature was forged, he mumbled, and the records were changed. At the same time, Elijah wanted to make it public. Carl circled the forgery, then called Sarah. "I have something. Financial evidence was fabricated." Sarah answered the phone in the nursing home yard. "I have news too," Ruth Ann confirmed. "Harold changed the lock on the file room right before Elijah disappeared. And she heard Grace scream in the hall that night." Carl was silent for a second, then said slowly, "They're running out of excuses, Sarah. But there's still one piece missing, where the bodies of Elijah or Grace were ever hidden. Without a body, no one can charge them." End of chapter. Sarah looked at the photo of Elijah holding his daughter's hand. The cold wind blew through the garden, carrying memories that had never rested. "I will find them. Not for revenge, but so that everything can be called by its proper name, and truly rest in peace." In her eyes, pain was no longer something that swallowed her, but a guiding light. Mount Olive Church, Friday afternoon. The sky was gloomy, the clouds thick like a funeral shroud. In the small meeting room behind the sanctuary, the dim fluorescent lights shone down on the long wooden table. Harold sat at the head of the table, dressed in his pastor's robes, his expression calm, George sat to his right, gripping his Bible, sweat beading on his forehead even though the room was cool. Sarah and Carl sat opposite them, papers neatly stacked in front of them. No one spoke for the first minute. The air was thick. Finally, Harold spoke. "I heard you wanted to talk more. I hope this isn't another rehashing of things that have been put to rest." Carl pushed forward a copy of Elijah's diary, opening it to the page with the line, "If they refuse to repent, I will speak before the congregation." Then he placed next to it Luther's statement, with his fingerprint, talking about the cart at midnight into the basement. Next was a photo of the two financial records, comparing handwriting and signatures, with a preliminary analysis by a handwriting expert. A printed report lay on top. The Harold Simmons signature in document number 2077 KF is highly likely to be forged. Sarah looked directly at Harold. "These aren't things put to rest. This is my husband, my daughter, and what you two did to cover it up." Harold's expression didn't change. He crossed his arms, leaning slightly forward, his voice as even as a lecture. "You're clinging to jumbled memories and old papers to disrupt the present. I understand the hurt. But we're in a respected community. Think of your husband's soul instead of stirring up graves." Carl smiled faintly. "If you really thought about other people's souls, you probably wouldn't have needed to hire someone to fix the basement at midnight." George turned his head to look at Carl. A glance, brief but unable to hide the wavering. Sarah caught it. She turned to George. Her voice wasn't loud but firm. "Do you remember what Elijah wrote?" "I'll read it to you again." She opened the diary, pointing to the last line on one page. "If they silence me, God will speak through others." George swallowed hard. Sarah looked deep into his eyes. "You know he's right. He found the wrongdoing. He believed God wouldn't let the truth be buried. And if you don't speak today, someone else will speak for you. But then, you won't be forgiven." Silence. Harold still sat still as a statue. But George's eyes left him for the first time. Carl shifted his chair forward. "I don't need you to confess anything here. I just need you to remember one thing. Everything you've ever hidden is starting to come out, and she won't stop." Carl gathered the documents. Sarah stood up. They left the room without saying another word. The door closed with a cold click, leaving the two men sitting between the dim yellow lights like in a silent interrogation room. That night, at Carl's house, while Sarah was making coffee, Carl went outside to get the newspaper. He found a thin brown envelope tucked under the door. Inside, a hand-drawn map in blue ink, hastily drawn, slightly shaky. No name, no message. Just a rough map, circling an area behind the old cemetery. An arrow pointed to a small dot near a large tree, next to the scrawled words, "Dead oak tree, behind the cemetery. Dig there." Carl went inside. Sarah took the paper, her eyes lighting up. The map was damp, the ink slightly smudged but still readable. Sarah folded it, her voice determined. "We're going there, before they erase the last trace." Carl reholstered the small pistol in his jacket. This was no longer a game of reason. It was time to confront the truth with action. It wasn't fully light when they arrived. Carl carried the flashlight. Sarah carried the map and Elijah's diary in her jacket pocket. Everything was wet after the rain last night. Mud stuck to their shoes, the air heavy with the smell of decaying leaves and thyme. The dead oak tree was easy to spot. A huge trunk, hollow, one side covered in white fungus. Underneath, weeds grew wildly, untouched for a long time. "Right here," Carl said. "The right location on the map." Sarah nodded. Carl pulled the shovel from the trunk and began to dig. Each layer of earth turned over was another year hidden. Sarah knelt down to help him, her hands trembling, not just from fatigue, but from what was about to appear. Less than half a meter deep, Carl's shovel hit something hard, an old cloth bag, almost rotten. They carefully removed the surrounding earth, pulling from the bottom of the hole a filthy cloth package, thick with the smell of metal, mold, and death. Opening it, Sarah turned away, tears welling up without warning. Inside were human bones, a torn piece of leather binding, and an old pastoral notebook, the spine scorched, the pages stained with blood. Carl pulled off his gloves, carefully turning the pages. Most of the pages were unreadable, but one page in the middle still had faint words. Under the flashlight, the words appeared, scrawled, as if written in pain. "I forgive them, but the truth needs to be told." Sarah couldn't stand up right away. She knelt there, clutching the blood-soaked page of her husband's notebook, bowing her head as if to breathe warmth into what was left. Carl placed his hand on her shoulder, a sharing that needed no words. "We need to call the police," he said softly. "Now they can't ignore it anymore." The police arrived within an hour. This time, there were no suspicious looks, no more, "The case is too old." The evidence was clear, concrete, and undeniable. The Eldridge Police Department opened a case that day. The pastoral notebook, remains, and bindings were transferred for examination. Carl provided Elijah's diary, Luther's statement, financial analysis, and the fake records. Formal arrest warrants were issued for Harold Simmons. When the police arrived at the church, Harold was still holding morning prayer services. He didn't resist, but when he was handcuffed, he maintained a casual tone. "I only did what needed to be done. You don't understand. The church needs order." An officer said softly, "Now the court will understand." George wasn't home. Carl immediately notified the Border Patrol. Just hours later, the news came. George was arrested while trying to leave Arkansas in a rented truck. In the truck, police found destroyed documents, including a copy of Elijah's diary and an old contact list of parishioners. George, when handcuffed, bowed his head, not saying a word. 3 days later, police were authorized to search the basement of Mount Olive Church. Carl accompanied the investigation team. Sarah didn't go in. She stood outside, still holding the pastoral notebook, like a final relic of Elijah. The basement was lit up. Old, patchy paint peeled off. Underneath, blood stains that had seeped into the cement walls still remained, even after being cleaned with chemicals. A forensic expert said, "There are signs of human blood spreading here, concentrated near the stairs. And it's old blood, very old, but it didn't disappear." Blood samples were collected. A few days later, tests came back. The DNA matched the records of Grace Freeman, Elijah's daughter. The police chief called Sarah personally. "Mrs. Freeman, we will bring this case to the prosecutor's office. The evidence is now sufficient to indict Harold Simmons and George Taylor with first-degree murder, intentional destruction of evidence, and obstruction of justice." Sarah only asked one question. "We can bury them again, right?" Evening fell on the Eldridge Cemetery. Sarah stood under the dead oak tree, clutching the diary, next to the place where Elijah's body was buried, now marked with a real headstone. Carl stood beside her. In the dim yellow light of the day, there was something like a breath of serenity. Not complete, but real. "We're almost done, Elijah," she whispered. "But your story will never be buried again." Nearly 3 decades after the disappearance of Elijah and Grace, the truth finally came to light. No longer a whisper, no longer fragmented memories, but an official trial where the perpetrators had to face the consequences. Eldridge County Courthouse, early autumn morning. The courtroom wasn't large, but it was packed. Local press filled the back rows, while the front was reserved for witnesses and family. Sarah sat in the 3rd row, next to Carl. She wore a simple black dress, holding Elijah's diary as part of herself. On the dock, Harold and George. Harold wore a gray suit, his head held high, his eyes cold. George wore a wrinkled white shirt, no tie. His hands trembled, his eyes avoiding anyone. The difference between them was clear. One still believed he could control it, and one was collapsing from within. The indictment was read aloud in court. First-degree murder, 2 victims, Elijah Freeman and Grace Freeman. Destruction, obstruction, and falsification of evidence. Embezzlement of church funds and abuse of office for personal gain. The prosecutor presented evidence one by one. Elijah's diary recording the plan to publicize wrongdoing. The blood-stained pastoral notebook excavated under the oak tree. Bloodstains matching Grace's DNA in the basement. Falsified accounting documents with forged signatures. Statements from Luther, Ruth Ann, and several new witnesses, including parishioners who had been threatened. Those who had been silent now stood up. A middle-aged parishioner, Mr. Arthur Hayes, who had been an assistant accountant at the church in 1977, testified, "I saw a large amount of money withdrawn from the charity fund. When I asked, Harold said it was a joint decision, but Elijah didn't sign. I asked again and was removed from my position." A Sunday school teacher, Mrs. Denise, also said, "I heard Grace crying in the church that night, but George said it was children's stories." The statements were no longer buried. A community that had been bound by blind faith now dared to face it for the first time. Sarah was invited to speak before the court. She stood up, walking slowly to the center of the room. The white light above shone down on her like a small stage. But not to perform, but to say words that she hadn't said for nearly 30 years. "I'm not seeking justice for myself. I'm finding faith again. Because what hurts me the most isn't the death of my husband and daughter, but the fact that we believed they were safe in a moral community, but that place abandoned them." She looked up, her eyes toward the rows of believers where many bowed their heads. "Elijah never left us. We left him because we were too trusting or too afraid to ask the right question." A silence filled the courtroom, but no longer the silence of concealment, but of awakening. The verdict was delivered 2 days later. Harold Simmons, guilty of first-degree murder and obstruction of justice, sentenced to life in prison without parole. He didn't react, just sat still, his eyes empty as if the world no longer belonged to him. George Taylor, due to cooperating with the investigation and telling the truth, his sentence was reduced, 20 years in prison, with no further reduction allowed. He cried as he was led out of the courtroom. No one applauded, no one cheered, but everyone stood up. A month after the trial, Eldridge entered an early winter. Leaves fell everywhere in the small alleys. Mount Olive Church lit up again for the first time in nearly 3 decades of just opening its doors as a formality. No baptisms, no sermons. Today, there was only one thing for people to come together for: a memorial to Elijah Freeman and his daughter, Grace. Mount Olive Church was filled with candlelight this morning. No more familiar solemn hymns, no pastor standing to preach. Under the wooden pulpit was a long table covered in white cloth, set between 2 photos: Elijah, resolute, warm eyes, and Grace, an innocent smile, her hair tied to the side, holding a doll. Between the 2 photos was Elijah's old diary, placed in a small glass case made of oak. The cover was worn, with bloodstains still showing, but the last page was as clear as new. "If they silence me, God will speak through others." Below the glass case, a bronze plaque was simply engraved, "The truth cannot be buried, as long as one person dares to search." The entire town attended. Some stood leaning against the doorframe, some quietly sat at the back. The old believers, those who had left the church, those who had believed or had been silent. They didn't come to be baptized, they came to listen and acknowledge. Carl sat in the front row wearing his old black suit, holding his hat, his eyes fixed on the altar. In those eyes was a long-held weariness finally allowed to fall. Sarah stood next to the pulpit, where her husband used to stand every Sunday morning. She didn't bring a speech, just held the old Bible, the one Elijah used to preach from, underlined, left beside the bed. She looked around. The church was as silent as when preparing for a first prayer. "I know, many of you here, used to believe Elijah had left us." She paused, her voice not reproachful, just like someone recounting an old sorrow. "But he never abandoned this town. We abandoned him. Because we were too trusting or too afraid to ask the right question." Sarah bowed her head for a moment, took a breath, and then looked up. Her voice didn't shake, but every word contained weight. "Today, I'm not standing here to talk about justice. The law has done its part. I'm also not standing here to talk about loss, because I didn't lose Elijah. I never lost him. Elijah left the most important thing, the truth." She turned to look at the diary in the glass case. He wrote in his own blood that, "If the truth is buried, then someone else will dig it up. And I'm just a wife, a mother, one left." In the silent hall, someone began to cry. Not noisy, not sentimental. The cry of acknowledgement, of releasing the burden in the chest for many years. Carl bowed his head, his hand shaking slightly. An old woman in the old choir walked to the altar, placing a white lily on it. A teenager, not clear from whose house, approached Sarah, handing her a scribbled drawing, an image of Elijah and Grace holding hands under the dead oak tree. The service had no hymns, but as Sarah stepped down from the pulpit, a voice rang out, not clear from where. It was the old hymn that Elijah often sang at the end of each sermon, "Let the truth be a light, even in the dark." In a late autumn afternoon, in a remote town, an old woman sat reading the old diary, her hand still shaking but her eyes still bright. Outside the window, leaves fell yellow on the yard, and somewhere between the rigid lines was the voice of the husband of yesteryear, ringing out not with sound, but with presence. "We may be forgotten, but always do what is kind so that they remember us with the best memories."